Hello and welcome. I just wanted to document an issue I've observed in my time playing Granblue Fantasy Versus. The issue of today's video has to do with the super armor frames on certain attacks and how it leads to dysfunction within these attacks. Let's get to it. In Granblue Versus, most super armored attacks are programmed with three components: startup frames, or the duration until the first active hitbox of the attack comes out; armor frames, or the duration in which the move has super armor active; and finally, recovery frames, or the duration directly after the last active hitbox frame. The relationship between these three components is detrimental in determining the balance of a move. Even beyond balance, there is another important relationship that determines an even more important factor: functionality. For an armored move, the most important factor is the time between the end of the armor frames and the beginning of the first active hitbox frames. Before I criticize Granblue's handlings of these three components and the functionality of armored attacks, let's look at some successful examples from other video game titles.
Show me your fighting spirit. If you don't, I'll destroy this planet!
This is Broly from Dragon Ball FighterZ. His 214M command grab has armor on it. Remember those three components I mentioned? Let's take a closer look at them, starting with the startup frames. Without charging the move, it takes 24 frames before the first active hitbox frame comes out. Next, let's look at armor frames. The first active armor frame begins on frame 4 and lasts until frame 24. Take note of how the armor frames overlap the startup frames. Also, take note of the duration in which the armor frames end and the hitbox begins. Notice anything? To spell it out, there is no duration. The hyper armor frames overlap the startup frames after a certain duration and cover the startup frames until the first active hitbox comes out. This is how you program an armored move properly. Lastly, recovery. This move has a staggering 22 frames of recovery, allowing a skilled player enough time to properly whiff punish this attack if they act proactively. This is a perfectly programmed armored move that checks all three boxes. Whiff punishable, armor and startup frames overlap until the first active frame of the hitbox, and non-instantaneous armor startup. Instantaneous armor startup frames are reserved only for reversal/DP type attacks, which we will explore later. For now, let's look at another ideal example from another video game. In Elden Ring, some weapon classes are much slower than others. To compensate for this, the balance team added hyper armor to some attacks on these weapons movesets. For those new to the channel, hyper armor is just super armor with terms and conditions that are balanced by the RPG and build-making element of the game. In the context of frame data, we can compare it directly to super armor. The Colossal Sword weapon class features this on its light attacks. Let's take a closer look, and just so we're on the same footing, the frame data measured in Elden Ring's game data is at 30 frames per second. Essentially, all of the numbers shown in the software I'm using will be multiplied by 2. For your convenience, I'll just refer to the frame data as it would be measured at 60 frames per second, just to be consistent. Let's begin with the startup frames. The Colossal Sword light attack has 34 frames of startup. At frame 16, the hyper armor kicks in and begins to overlap the startup frames of the attack, and lasts until frame 52. 16 frames after the first active hitbox frame comes out. Lastly, this move has 24 frames of recovery. Take note of how the armor frames overlap the startup frames after a certain point and continue to overlap the startup frames until the first active hitbox frame comes out. This is done to prevent you from being interrupted if you successfully make the right read and counter your opponent. Another prime example of how an armored attack should be programmed. With punishable, armor and startup frames overlap until the first active frame of the hitbox, and fast but not instant armor frames. Another perfectly programmed and functional armored attack. Let's take a look at another ideal example from another video game.
守るべき者のために負けられない
Roy in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has a special move that functions as a pseudo-reversal. Not unlike the other examples, this attack, known as Blazer, has super armor. Let's dissect it further. This attack has a blinding 9 frames of startup. On frame 4, this move has super armor. The super armor frames overlap the startup frames at this point and continue to do so until frame 10, before and after the first frame in which the active hitbox comes out. Because it's a platform fighter, the recovery of this move can vary, but at the very least, it's 30 frames. You're fucked if you miss this attack. Let's review. Fast but not instant armor startup frames? Check. Whiff punishable? Check. Armor frames overlap startup frames until the first active hitbox comes out? Check. On to the next example. This is Soul Bad Guy. He has a special attack known as Heavy Mob Cemetery. This attack has armor like the other examples. Let's take a closer look, beginning with the startup frames. This attack has 20 frames of startup before the first active hitbox comes out. This move has super armor as early as frame 14 and lasts until frame 35. Naturally, like the other examples, its armor frames overlap its startup frames and continue to do so until after the first frame of its active grab box comes out. Lastly, it's got 49 frames of recovery. You're fucked if you miss this attack. Let's review. Fast but not instant armor startup frames? Check. Whiff punishable? Check. Armor frames overlap startup frames until the first active grab box comes out? Check. I could go on all day with more examples, but for the sake of time, I'll spare you from my nerding out. The main takeaway is that these 4 examples all have the same thing in common. Almost as if these 4 different balance teams that programmed these 4 attacks knew exactly what makes an armored attack balanced, functional, and intuitive, despite some of them likely never having spoken to each other. Finally, let's explore where Granblue Versus dropped the ball. Here's a prime example of what's wrong with some armored attacks in Granblue Versus. While balanced relatively well, nearly all of them share a common issue. Let's dissect the frame data. Vayne's 5U has 25 frames of startup. Pretty quick for an armored move. The armor starts on frame 3 and ends on frame 18, a whopping 7 frames before the first active hitbox comes out. What's the issue with this exactly? Well, this basically means that any attack that comes out in 7 frames or lower can interrupt Vayne after he's already committed to tanking a hit. As you can imagine, every character in the game can interrupt Vayne after he's already committed to tanking a hit. This renders Vayne's 5U dysfunctional by design. An armored attack in any video game ever is designed to tank through an attack in order to remain uninterrupted to deliver a counterattack. i.e., when your armored attack doesn't armor through an attack, it's dysfunctional. When your thing doesn't do what it was designed to do, it's dysfunctional. To reiterate, this is all due to the armor frames ending before the first active frame of the hitbox. This rewards players that mindlessly mash attack into this move, which is the exact thing the move was designed to counter. The easiest fix would be to extend the duration of the armor to end on frame 25 so that Vayne can get his armored attack out without his armor malfunctioning. This is not to say Vayne is a bad character or anything of the sort. I've seen my share of developer oversights across my decade of playing From Software games. I know an oversight when I've seen one. Also, please don't mistake me for nagging balance about the character that has just come out. 1, it's not balance, it's bug fixing, and 2, this has been an issue with other characters since the release of the game. Let's take a look at more, shall we? Okay, I've got a huge bone to pick with this stupid-ass attack. It seems to me like the balance team hadn't a single idea of what to do with this attack. Let's begin with the dissection. Like Vayne's 5U, Ultimate Verdrangen has armor. At a glance, you might be thinking, wow, 20 frames of armor. That's a lot. But all of that comes crumbling down due to the fact that the armor's active frames deactivate 6 frames before the first active hitbox comes out. This means the same thing as it did with Vayne's 5U. Players will be rewarded for mindlessly pressing on an armored attack. The very thing that armored attacks are designed to combat. It's dysfunctional, we already know that. But what's even worse is that the attack is unblockable. Why? In what world is a super armored attack justifiably made unblockable? What's that? You don't have the answer? Let me tell you. I have no other option. This self-destruct attack from Android 16 in Dragon Ball FighterZ. Aside from it being an obvious reference to the show, it takes a whopping 65 frames to complete, has armor on it for the entire duration, and is unblockable. It makes sense. You will never land this attack unless your opponent lets it happen voluntarily. It's that kind of move. Back to Ultimate Verdrangen, this attack should guard crush at the very most. The attack itself is highly telegraphed and slow, of course, but it has armor to make up for that. Or it at least should have functioning armor to make up for it. As of right now, the armor is dysfunctional, but that doesn't justify it being unblockable. I'm coming to you as someone that mains this character and has made a 30-minute guide on how to play the character. This attack being unblockable is overtuned. The balance for this attack is all over the place, but fixing it would be simple. Extend the armor to end on frame 35 as opposed to frame 29. Instead of making it unblockable, I propose making the attack hit overhead and guard crush on block. Doing so ensures it retains its identity as a risky trade type move that is both rewarding on block and rewarding on hit, without being too strong. Let's look at another example. Finally, our last example, Ladiva's Ultimate Headbutt. This is the least egregious example in our list, but unfortunately, still dysfunctional. This special attack functions as a reversal, having 22 frames of startup before the first active hitbox comes out. As you probably expected, this move suffers the same issues as the last two moves. The super armor frames start on frame 1 and end on frame 18. Leaving a 4-frame gap of vulnerability in which Ladiva can be interrupted during her super armored reversal. Imagine having a reversal that costs half of your meter, loses to throws, and can be interrupted by strikes. I am truly sorry, Ladiva players. Here's an idea. Fix the super armor frames to last until frame 22 so that Ladiva's reversal can be used as a reversal, as it was obviously intended to. Now then, that's enough ragging on the people that let these oversights slip past them. Believe me, it happens. I would know. Obviously, being a fighting game, the balance team knows what they're doing. There are super armored attacks already present in Granblue verses that are programmed as they should be, i.e., with the super armor frames overlapping the startup frames until or after the first active hitbox comes out. Let's take a look at them. I'll display a graphic of the frame data so that the tangible difference between the moves is visible. Let's get to it. Example 1. Vaseraga 46M. 26 frames of startup. Armor starts on frame 5 and ends on frame 41. As you can see, the armor overlaps the startup frames and remains overlapped well after the first frame the active hitbox comes out. A competently programmed and functional armored move. Example 2. Nier 623H. 12 frames of startup. Armor starts on frame 1 and ends on frame 23. As you can see, the armor frames overlap the startup frames at a certain point and remain overlapped until the first frame the active hitbox is out. Another competently programmed and functional armored move, as it should be. Example 3. Soriz 6X during 5U. 11 frames of startup, armor starts on frame 1 and ends on frame 13. As you can see, the armor frames overlap the startup frames at a certain point and stay overlapped until the first frame the active hitbox comes out. Another competently programmed and functional armored move, as it should be.
Into the unknown. Enchanted land!
Example 4. Katalina 214U. 9 frames of startup, armor starts on frame 7 and ends on frame 10. As you can see, the armor frames overlap the startup frames at a certain point and stay overlapped until the first frame the hitbox becomes active. Another competently programmed and functional armored move, as it should be. Those are all the ones off the top of my head, but I think listing any more would be unnecessary. The difference between these moves and the ones mentioned earlier is tangible, but to reiterate, the issue stems from the gaps between the armor frames and the first active hitbox frames. As you can see, the dysfunctional attacks have gaps, and the functional attacks do not have gaps. That is the difference between them. That's all I've got for today's video. Hopefully the devs see this and I'm not just ranting to the 15 of you that still watch my videos. Anyways, thanks for watching. Until next time.